The roar of my motorcycle echoed through the quiet neighborhood as I pulled into my driveway, the sun just dipping below the horizon. That's when I heard it, a sharp voice cutting through the calm. "Excuse me, that thing doesn't belong here." I looked up to see her, arms crossed, lips pursed, the unmistakable stance of a woman used to getting her way. Karen. From across the street, she marched over like a sheriff patrolling her turf. "This is a family neighborhood, no motorcycles. It's in the HOA rules," she claimed, but it wasn't, not even close. Before I could answer, my next-door neighbor stepped out. "Leave him alone, Karen. You can't make up rules because you don't like something." More doors opened. More voices joined in. What started as a solo standoff turned into something bigger than I expected. But to understand how it got to that point, let me take you back. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I'd found my slice of peace. Clean sidewalks, neatly trimmed lawns, friendly waves from neighbors, and a quiet cul-de-sac that felt like the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. After years of city noise and constant chaos, this was exactly what I needed. I was just another homeowner looking to settle down, keep to myself, and enjoy the little things, like weekend barbecues, working in the garage, and cruising home on my motorcycle after a long day at work. The bike wasn't just a vehicle to me, it was freedom, it was therapy. I'd saved for years to buy it, and I treated it like gold. Never rode it recklessly, never revved the engine late at night, always respectful. And according to the HOA agreement I'd signed when I bought the place, there wasn't a single rule banning motorcycles. I double-checked, even triple-checked, just to be sure. I had no reason to believe anyone would have a problem with it. For the first few weeks, everything was smooth. I nodded at neighbors, kept my yard tidy, and followed every regulation down to the letter. I knew how these HOA communities worked. One wrong move, and suddenly you're the subject of gossip and committee meetings. So I played it safe. I never parked on the grass. I kept noise to a minimum. I even waved at the HOA board president when I saw her walking her dog. She didn't wave back. Her name was Karen, and while I didn't know it yet, she was the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. The kind of person who reported your trash cans if they weren't brought in by 6 p.m. sharp. I thought staying under the radar would be enough, but it turns out just existing with a motorcycle was all it took to end up in her crosshairs. What happened next? It turned a quiet street into a battleground and revealed a side of my neighbors I never saw coming. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I had just finished a grueling shift and was looking forward to the short ride home, the wind in my face, the hum of the engine soothing my tired mind. As I rolled into the neighborhood, I downshifted and coasted into my driveway, careful not to make too much noise. I always killed the engine quickly, just out of respect. I hadn't even taken off my helmet when I heard the click of heels against concrete. I turned my head and there she was, Karen. She stood at the edge of my lawn like she owned it, arms crossed so tight it looked like she was holding in steam. Her eyes locked onto me like I was a threat, not a neighbor. "That motorcycle," she started, voice sharp and dripping with disdain, "doesn't belong in this neighborhood. It's disruptive, dangerous, and not family-friendly." I blinked. At first I thought she was joking, but her glare said otherwise. I calmly removed my helmet and tried to keep the peace. "Actually, I've reviewed the HOA bylaws. There's nothing that says motorcycles aren't allowed." I kept my tone friendly but firm. She shook her head like I was a child who just didn't understand. "The rules are there to protect our community's image," she said. "This is a respectable place, not some biker hangout." I wanted to laugh, but I held it in. I work full-time, I don't race. I'm just commuting home like anyone else. But Karen wasn't interested in logic. She looked past me, scanning my garage like she was planning her next complaint. "Don't be surprised if you get a notice," she said, spinning on her heel and walking away like she had just delivered a legal verdict. I stood there for a moment, stunned. I had expected some adjustment moving in, maybe the usual small talk about lawns and mailboxes. But this was different. This was targeted. That encounter was the first time I realized Karen wasn't just nosy, she was on a mission. And I had just unknowingly become her latest project. What I didn't realize then was how far she'd go, or how the neighborhood would respond when things started heating up. A few days after our first confrontation, I found a neatly folded paper wedged into the frame of my front door. It wasn't a welcome note or a flyer. It was a formal notice from the HOA, citing me for excessive vehicle noise and operating a non-compliant vehicle on HOA property. My first reaction was confusion. The language was vague, and the complaint was anonymous. I had done everything by the book. My motorcycle met all legal requirements, and I had even gone as far as installing a quieter exhaust system out of courtesy. Still, here was this letter, cold and accusatory, delivered with the weight of authority. I chalked it up to Karen blowing smoke and decided to let it slide. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA board would see it for what it was and move on. But then came the second letter. This time it accused me of creating a hostile atmosphere through aggressive engine use. Aggressive engine use. I was beginning to wonder if she thought I was drag racing down the block at midnight. I started documenting everything. I took photos of where I parked. I recorded short clips of me arriving home, showing how brief and quiet the process really was. I even spoke with a few neighbors, asking if the bike bothered them. Most were surprised I even owned one. "You're the one with the motorcycle," one said. "I've never heard a thing." Soon I noticed Karen lurking more frequently near her porch, phone in hand, camera at the ready. I caught her taking pictures of my driveway, pretending to check her mailbox. One morning, I watched her sneak around the corner and snap a photo as I put on my helmet. It was invasive and creepy. And still the letters kept coming. One cited a safety risk to children playing outside. Another accused me of lowering property values with a non-traditional vehicle. Each claim more outlandish than the last, none backed by anything real. I knew what was happening. Karen was using the HOA as her personal weapon, flooding it with complaints in the hope that the sheer volume would get me to fold. But I wasn't ready to fold. I was getting angry, and I was getting prepared. What I didn't expect, though, was that I wasn't the only one paying attention. Something was shifting on the block, quietly at first, like a fuse being lit. It wasn't long after the fifth letter arrived that word started spreading about a petition. At first, it was just murmurs, neighbors mentioning that Karen was doing something about the motorcycle problem. That's how she phrased it, the motorcycle problem, as if my quiet commute was a public hazard. Then one afternoon, I overheard her on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, stopping an elderly couple who lived 2 houses down. "Just sign here," she said. "It's to protect the peace and safety of the neighborhood. You don't want noise scaring your dog or your grandkids, do you?" When I asked around, some people admitted they signed because they didn't want to be on her bad side. Others said they didn't understand what they were signing. But what pushed me over the edge was when I finally got a copy of the petition. Karen had presented it at the HOA board meeting as a block-wide demand to amend the HOA rules banning motorcycles from residential areas. It was filled with names, some of them real, many of them suspicious. I checked. A few were misspelled versions of actual residents. Some were completely made up. One neighbor, Mr. Tanaka, had been out of the country for 3 weeks and somehow managed to sign it twice. When I confronted her about it at the next meeting, she didn't even flinch. "People are intimidated," she claimed. "They don't want to speak up because of retaliation." But then something strange happened. Neighbors started coming to me quietly, one by one. I didn't know she was trying to ban motorcycles entirely, one woman said. I thought it was about noise late at night. Another man admitted, she told me it was a general safety petition. I never would have signed it if I knew it was aimed at you. Karen had used fear, half-truths, and manipulation to divide the block. Some neighbors started looking at each other with suspicion. Others avoided talking altogether. It was no longer just about my bike. It was about trust, about control, and about how far one person would go to enforce her version of what our neighborhood should be. But cracks were beginning to show in her plan. People were waking up, starting to realize they'd been misled. And that shift was about to become a wave. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening in the community clubhouse, the kind of place usually reserved for birthday parties and cookie swaps. But that night, it had the tension of a courtroom. I walked in with a folder under my arm, filled with documents, photos, videos, and a printed copy of the HOA bylaws, highlighted, tabbed, and ready. I wasn't there to fight dirty. I was there to defend myself with facts, something Karen seemed allergic to. She was already there, sitting in the front row, smug as ever, clipboard balanced on her lap like a crown. As the meeting began, the board asked if there were any issues to bring forward, and before anyone else could speak, Karen stood up. Yes, she said with theatrical flair. We have a recurring issue of non-compliance. A resident has brought a motorcycle into our peaceful neighborhood, causing noise, fear, and disruption. We've received multiple complaints and a petition calling for the board to ban such vehicles. The room was quiet. I could feel the eyes turning toward me, some curious, others concerned. I stood slowly and walked up to the board's table, taking a deep breath. I'd like to respond, I said calmly. One of the board members nodded. I laid my folder down and began. First, there is no current HOA bylaw that prohibits motorcycle ownership or use. None. I've printed and highlighted the entire document, which I'd be happy to share. I passed them copies and continued. Second, I have video evidence showing how quietly I ride. No loud revving, no late-night starts. Just respectful, ordinary use. I played a short clip from my phone, me pulling into the driveway, engine barely louder than a car. Then I held up the petition Karen had circulated. Many of these signatures were either faked, misrepresented, or obtained through misleading claims. One resident signed twice while out of the country. Several others have since come to me, saying they didn't know what they were signing. Karen shifted in her seat. Her expression tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Finally, I said, locking eyes with the board, this isn't about a motorcycle. It's about one person trying to impose her personal preferences on an entire community. I've done nothing wrong. I've followed every rule, and I deserve to live here in peace, just like everyone else. There was a beat of silence, and then someone in the back clapped. Just once, then another joined in. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was enough. The board said they would review the situation, consider my evidence, and revisit the rules. Karen tried to speak again, but they cut her off. We've heard enough for tonight. I walked out into the night air feeling something shift. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab the mail and nearly dropped the stack when I saw what was parked across the street, a gleaming black Harley-Davidson, polished to perfection, with chrome details that caught the sunlight like mirrors. Standing next to it, arms folded and smirking like he'd been waiting years for this moment, was Mr. Jenkins, my neighbor 3 doors down. Vietnam vet, quiet as a mouse, always wore the same flannel and baseball cap. I'd never even heard the man speak more than a few words. But today, he looked like a man on a mission. I heard what happened at the meeting, he said, nodding toward my house. Thought I'd give my girl a stretch down the block today. Hope Karen's awake. Then he winked and fired up the engine. It purred low and steady, controlled, dignified. Nothing like the wild beast Karen had made it out to be. The sound echoed through the street like a symbol, not of rebellion, but of solidarity. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Not with just motorcycles, but with scooters, e-bikes, even an old neighbor who brought out his 1980s moped for a joyride. It was like the whole block had decided quietly and cleverly to make a point. I started receiving waves, nods, casual conversations from people who used to just pass by. A young couple who lived across the cul-de-sac stopped me one evening. "We have a little Vespa," the wife said. "We've always been afraid to ride it because of Karen. But now it feels like we're allowed to exist." It was subtle at first. Sidewalk chats, friendly smiles, people mowing their lawns at the same time just to say hello. But soon, it became more visible. Someone chalked a drawing of a motorcycle with "Ride Free" under it on the community walkway. Another resident organized a small Sunday coffee meetup and told me, "You better show up on your bike." I realized what was happening wasn't just about me. Karen had overplayed her hand, and the neighborhood had had enough. People weren't just defending my right to ride. They were reclaiming their own right to not be afraid of one voice dominating the rest. The street started to feel like a neighborhood again. Where once there had been silence and suspicion, there was now conversation and a strange kind of joy. Karen still watched from her window, phone in hand, but now when she glared, people glared back. Not with anger, but with a calm, unspoken message. This is our street too. And no one gets to decide what it means to belong all by themselves. The HOA meeting that would decide everything was held the following week. This time, the room was packed. People who had never attended a single board discussion were suddenly showing up early, filling every plastic chair in the clubhouse. Some stood along the walls, arms crossed, eyes sharp. The tension buzzed like electricity in the air. Karen sat at the front, rigid and silent, her usual composure replaced by a tight jaw and darting glances. Her clipboard was there, but it looked more like a shield now than a weapon. The board began by reviewing the issue. They summarized the complaints, the counterpoints, and the overwhelming response from the community over the past week. They acknowledged the petition, but also the concerns about how it was presented and the irregularities in the signatures. Then came the moment we were all waiting for. A board member stood up and said, "Tonight, we're voting on whether or not to amend our HOA bylaws to specifically restrict the use or presence of motorcycles in our neighborhood." The room went completely silent. They cast their votes one by one, 5 board members in total. First vote, no. Second, no. Third, no. Fourth, a reluctant no. Fifth, a firm, decisive no. Not a single vote in favor. The amendment was rejected. My right to ride and everyone else's was safe. A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing into a loud, genuine cheer. People clapped each other on the back, some even hugged. I turned to look at Karen, sitting stone-faced in the front row, her knuckles white around her pen. She stood abruptly, face flushed, and hissed loud enough for those around her to hear, "You've all ruined this neighborhood." Then she stormed out, her heels clicking like gunshots across the tile floor. Nobody followed her. The board thanked everyone for attending, encouraged open communication in the future, and dismissed the meeting. As people filtered out, I had more conversations that night than I had in the month since moving in. People thanked me for standing up. A teenage kid whispered that I'd made the block feel cooler. Mr. Jenkins gave me a quiet nod before heading off into the night on his Harley. Karen didn't resign from the board, but her influence vanished. No more surprise notices, no more fake petitions. Just silence. And not the uneasy, tense kind we'd all grown used to, but peaceful, genuine quiet, broken only by the occasional purr of an engine pulling into a driveway. The neighborhood had spoken. And for once, everyone had listened. In the weeks that followed, things settled into a new rhythm. The kind where people nodded a little longer when they passed you on the street, where conversations lingered at mailboxes just a bit more than before. My bike remained in its usual place, no longer a target, just another part of the neighborhood landscape. The letters stopped. The sideways glances faded. Karen, though still living across the street, retreated into the background. She walked her dog without the usual authority in her step, no longer scanning every lawn for a reason to write someone up. What surprised me most wasn't that I won. It was how many people had been waiting for someone to stand up first. I had thought I was alone, but the truth was, plenty of others had been tired of the silent control Karen had held over everyone. They just needed a spark. And that spark turned into something stronger than I could have predicted. It made me realize that community isn't about everyone agreeing on every little thing. It's about mutual respect, about protecting each other's right to live peacefully, without fear of being policed for personal preferences. My motorcycle didn't define me, but it became a symbol of something much bigger. It reminded people that one person's voice, no matter how loud, doesn't get to drown out everyone else. Now, when I roll in after a long day, I don't do it with hesitation. I do it with pride. Not because I beat Karen, but because I learned what it meant to be part of a neighborhood that finally found its voice. And sometimes, it takes the low rumble of an engine to remind people that silence isn't the same as peace. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA or a neighborhood bully like Karen, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories, just like this one. Your voice matters, and together, we make communities stronger. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the smallest stand can make the loudest noise. Stay respectful, stay true to yourself, and never let anyone scare you into silence. I'll see you in the next one.